From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan. As the world looks to the recent developments in China-U.S. relations for de-escalating tensions and retrieving their initial friendship ping-ponged up 50 years ago, international scholars have been studying for decades whether China's rise will be peaceful or confrontational. Some have made reliable analysis and predictions. Among them, Professor John Mearsheimer from the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Earlier, I had a talk with him, and let's take a look at what he makes sense of the current Beijing-Washington balance. Sir, welcome to CGTN again.
I'm pleased to be here.
Professor Mearsheimer, as early as 2 decades ago, you predicted that there would be a clash, a confrontation between China and the United States. And guess what? You were largely right. What is your prediction now on the future of U.S.-China competition, both in the short term and in the long run?
Well, I think that there's no question that the security competition will continue for the foreseeable future, for as far as the eye can see. There's no way that they can both be the dominant military power in the region. With regard to sophisticated technologies, which really matter in today's world, either the United States is the dominant country in terms of developing sophisticated technologies, or China is the dominant country. And these two countries are in a competition. The United States has been number one for a long period of time. And we're now in a world where the Chinese are capable of catching up with, if not surpassing, the United States. And needless to say, the United States doesn't want that to happen. And the Chinese, on the other hand, do want it to happen. And who wins this competition over, the decades ahead is probably the most important question involving the international system in the decades ahead. I think it will become more intense with the passage of time, in large part because China will become more powerful and it will become more assertive. And at the same time, the United States will go to greater lengths to contain China and even think about rolling back Chinese power. So as bad as things are today, I think they're likely to get worse in the future.
But Professor Mearsheimer, do you think it is necessarily a zero-sum game, a either-or proposition for these Asian countries? Do they have to pick and choose either China or the United States?
Well, I think there's no question that East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, the Philippines, so forth and so on, at some point, they're going to have to clearly choose one side or the other. And I think in almost all of those cases, they will side with the United States against China. I think that there will continue to be significant trade and investment involving China and Japan, or China and Australia, and China and the United States. So all economic intercourse is not going to shut down. So the choice facing these East Asian countries is not quite as black and white as your question makes it out to be.
I mean, we can regard the whole international community as this one global village under this economic globalization. If you think about COVID, I mean, no country is safe until all is safe. You think about climate change, we're all in this together. Can't you look at it that way?
Well, I think there's no question that there are certain areas in which China and the United States will cooperate. I think proliferation is one of those issues, for example. I think that the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians will all cooperate to limit nuclear proliferation. I think with regard to climate change and pandemics, you're likely to get significant cooperation on those fronts as well. But the key point is that the overall relationship between the United States and China will be one of competition, strategic competition. And it'll be a dangerous competition because there will always be the possibility that that competition will turn into a war. So you'll have some cooperation, but it'll be part and parcel of an intense security competition. Now, you say, isn't this an outdated way of thinking about international politics? Hasn't the world changed? The answer is no.
Professor, when it comes to Joe Biden's China policy, many liberals, including some in the Biden administration, would say that the necessity to contain a rising China is because it clash in ideas, in values. They point out the so-called human rights abuses in Xinjiang. They called out, the issue of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and also what they call the authoritarian model of governance. Do you think that is really the case? Is America afraid of China because of values?
I think there's no question that rhetorically, American policymakers and American elites in general will emphasize that the competition between the United States and China is about ideology. It's about two different political systems competing with each other. And this is analogous to what happened in the Cold War when we talked about the Soviet Union as a communist state and the United States as a capitalist democracy. Ideology was very important rhetorically in the Cold War, as it will be in the US-China competition. Is this really a competition that's ideological at its core? The answer is no. The United States has had wonderful relations with China for a long period of time, for many decades. Nevertheless, the United States in 1985, 1995, 2005, and 2015 had no difficulty dealing with this authoritarian or communist state. There's been no change in the political system in China. So what's going on here is that to mobilize political support in the West against China, and even in East Asia against China, but that's not what's driving the train here. What's driving the train is power politics. So it's that power competition, not ideological competition, that is the root cause of the situation that we see today.
How do you think US-China competition can be coped with? I mean, how can the two countries really cope with the negative fallout, the negative consequences of their future competition?
Well, the one negative consequence, to use your language, that we want to avoid is a shooting war. It's one thing to have an intense security competition. It's another thing to actually have a war between China and the United States. And we want to go to great lengths, both Beijing and Washington, to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's going to be very difficult to do because, again, China is bent on changing the status quo. And if you believe that China is going to continue to grow economically and it's going to continue to grow militarily, China is going to think seriously about using military force to change the status quo to its advantage. And the United States will go to great lengths to prevent that from happening. China
Eradicated poverty last year, according to official data, and also it is launching the 14th five-year plan, a guiding roadmap, guiding China's economy and social political development. How do you look at those domestic Chinese programs?
I think that they have been largely successful. I mean, I think there's no question that huge numbers of people have been lifted out of poverty in China over the past 4 or 5 decades. And from a Chinese perspective, this is a wonderful thing. And I would imagine that the Chinese government will go to great lengths to sustain those gains and to bring those people who are left in poverty out of poverty. So this is, a great accomplishment. And in terms of running the economy, few countries in the history of the world have done a better job of growing their economy than Chinese leaders have done. I mean, they have been wildly successful. That's why, in my opinion, we now have this strategic competition. I think, to be honest, the biggest problem the Chinese face moving forward in terms of domestic politics is population decline. I think this is a worldwide problem. It's not limited to China by any means. In fact, I think South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. Japan has a remarkably low birth rate. The United States is beginning to experience a downward movement in its birth rate, and there's no sign that that's going to slow up.
So in your previous interviews, you talk about the fact that you read Chinese classics, such as those of Confucius, and also The Art of War by Sun Tzu. How have those Chinese classics informed your scholarship, or what are your takeaways from those Chinese books?
I find those Chinese books very interesting, especially Sun Tzu. But I'm a realist. I believe that you look at great powers and you try to understand how they act. It's almost always the case that they act in similar ways because the structure of the international system just does not leave them much choice. So I think that when you look at Chinese behavior and you try to predict Chinese behavior moving forward, Confucianism tells you very little about how China will behave. And what really tells you a great deal about Chinese foreign policy behavior is basic realist logic. I often say that I'm more at home intellectually when I go to China than I am in the United States when I go to Washington. And this is because I think the Chinese are realists to the core. Now, some of that has Sun Tzu in it because Sun Tzu was a clever realist at heart. But with regard to Confucianism, Confucianism is an ideology that in fundamental ways is at odds with basic realist logic. And again, my argument is China is a realist country to the core, and Confucianism matters little for its foreign policy.
That's Professor Mearsheimer's reading of China-U.S. relations. We'll continue with our story on ping-pong diplomacy after the break. Welcome back. 50 years ago, an encounter between ping-pong players from China and the U.S. broke the trans-Pacific ice and paved way for Kissinger and Nixon's visits. Half a century has passed. Paddlers from the two nations paired up again to join the World Table Tennis Championships in Houston. Will the legacy of ping-pong diplomacy cool down the boiling disagreements between Beijing and Washington and refresh their friendship in the years to come? We're very happy to be joined by Mr. Scott Ross, Hollywood producer and film executive known for pioneering visual effects in some of the world's most well-known blockbusters, including Titanic, The Lord of the Rings, Terminator, Back to the Future, Apollo 13, to name just a few. His upcoming project speaks on a very important issue, that is the ping-pong diplomacy. Scott, great to have you here on the Hub on CGTN. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. Nice to see you, or talk to you anyways.
Scott, I know that you're currently trying to make a feature film on ping-pong diplomacy. Without spoiling the fun, what can you tell us about this project?
Well, years ago, when I started thinking about what China and the United States could be doing in terms of co-productions, I started noticing films like Michael Bay films and other Hollywood films, which seemed to be really a one-sided film. It was a U.S. production, and they would throw in a Chinese actor or actress or maybe a Chinese department store, and they would just pull in money from China. And I thought to myself, that didn't feel right. You really needed, if you're going to do a co-production with China, it needs to ring true. It needs to be about the Chinese sensibility and the U.S. sensibility. And so in doing some research, this is back in 2015, I came upon something that I was alive at the time, because I'm that old, which was ping-pong diplomacy. And the more research that I did, the more I became enamored with the concept that this was bringing peace and caring and bridging two cultures, and it was done through sport. And being a musician, I've always thought that music, art, and sports were the things that could bring people together across cultures. And so I got very excited about the possibility of creating a film. So I raised some money out of China and a little out of the US and started to develop the screenplay, do a bunch of research, hire writers, both Chinese and American. And we've developed the screenplay. And then in 2016, Mr. Trump was elected president. And as a result, relations between China and the US had started to fall apart. And so I've been sitting on the script now for about 4 or 5 years. And I've decided to reinvigorate it and revitalize it because I'm looking at the situation, and I think your previous guest was perfect, talking about a lot of the issues between the United States and China. And it's not quite as bad as it was in the early 1970s, but it looks like it's bad and it might get worse. And I thought, what a great time to be able to bring ping-pong diplomacy into the spotlight once again and discuss how these wonderful characters from back in the day in 1970 really brought together our two countries and allowed both countries to become stronger and better and more economically feasible. So that was the premise of which I started the project.
Right, Scott, you talked about a desire to have this project becoming, a real China-U.S. co-production feature film about sport, about ping-pong diplomacy. We know some other Hollywood films, such as Mission Impossible series. One of them took a scene from Wuzhen, and also in Shanghai. But many would argue those are not perfect depictions of what today's China is truly like. What do you think? What do you envision your film? In what ways do you think that would be different from other Hollywood films about China?
Well, because we were so involved with the China side that we really felt like we got a real understanding of what Chinese culture and Chinese society was all about and how focused these young men were back in the early 1970s to put China back on the stage of a world sports country and working as hard as they did. And the dedication and focus that the Chinese team had was incredible. And so, we in this film, in our screenplay, we're not yet a film yet, in our screenplay, politics really is in the background. It's not a focal point. There's no discussion really about politics. It's a discussion about passion and desire and teamwork. And I think the teamwork and passion and desire of the Chinese team was exemplary, which catapults them to the #1 team in the world.
So you think sport can do something that diplomacy and politics cannot?
I think we've seen that. I think diplomacy sometimes gets caught up, and worse yet, the prospect of any armed conflict is frightening and horrible, and I can't imagine it happening in the modern age. So there must be a way to be able to bring our two cultures together and realize that both the United States and China benefits as a relationship. I listened to your last guest, and the concept of only having a single superpower in the world, I don't understand what that means in the world of globalization. I think there needs to be cooperation. I'm reminded of Yo-E De Bisaidiar, which is the famous friendship first, competition second line, which is critical in these days. And I think that's what Ping-pong diplomacy was about, and that's what we're trying to show with this film.
Yeah, this sportsmanship can go a long way. Chinese and American paddlers teamed up again in the World Table Tennis Championship that is taking place currently in Houston, the United States. How would you compare this China-U.S. union or reunion with ping-pong diplomacy 50 years ago?
Well, I think ping-pong diplomacy 50 years ago was a unique moment in time. It was a moment in time where China really had been closed to the U.S. The U.S. really had no knowledge of, or Americans had no knowledge and understanding about what China was all about, what its culture was about. And the opportunity to be able to experience China and bring our people, you know, with Chairman Mao's invitation to bring our table tennis players to China was extraordinary. Our State Department at the time was shocked. You know, they couldn't imagine that this was going to happen. In fact, the State Department at the time, the U.S. State Department, didn't support the table tennis team. They thought it was all a joke. They thought table tennis in the United States was not a real sport. You know, they were football people and baseball people. So when Chairman Mao invited the team, wow, that just you know, blew minds. People were so excited about the possibility, and history was made. And I think, you know, in Houston, the zeitgeist of the times between China and the U.S. is a very different situation than it was back in the early 70s.
You know, talking about sport, the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics are around the corner. We heard from some, you know, Western politicians saying that they're actively considering a diplomatic boycott, whatever that means, of the Beijing Winter Olympics. Your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, again, I go back to ping pong and what happened in the early 70s. The thought of boycotting an Olympic is almost an anathema, is against everything what the Olympics is about. The Olympics is about friendship first, competition second. And yes, they're competitive, and we all want to win more golds than anyone else. But the Olympic Village is a unique place, and the Olympics is a unique opportunity for the world to come together under the competitive nature of sports, leaving politics, ideology, and all of that stuff behind. And the melting pot of what the Olympic Village is incredible. So I'm disappointed that American and some Western diplomats will not go. I think that's exactly against what Olympics stand for.
Yeah. So in
more talk, more compassion, more caring is what works.
Yeah, in you know, 60 days, in a little over 2 months, there will be the Winter Olympics. This will be the second time in 12, 13 years that China will have hosted the second Olympics. What are you looking for when you look at these you know, Winter Games?
Well, you know, because I'm an entertainment guy, I was blown away by the opening ceremonies of the last Beijing Olympics, and I'm the guy who watches the commercials during Super Bowl, you know, so
yeah,
I'm really excited to see exactly what happens in the opening ceremonies of the games, and the amazing technology, craftsmanship, and artistry that the Chinese will bring to this year's Olympics. That's what I'm most excited about.
You know, talking about Chinese films, they have generated mixed results globally. Of course, within China, you know, when you look at some of China's highest grossing films ever, Wolf Warrior 2, The Battle at Lake Changjin-Hu, they're doing exceedingly well here in China. But overseas, that's not the case. The vast majority of their global box office revenue comes from the Chinese mainland market, not from the overseas market. And if you compare that against 2 decades earlier, when you think about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or House of Flying Daggers, those films were performing really well overseas, you know, appealing to a Western audience. How do you look at this phenomenon? Why do you think this has been the case? What changed?
Well, first of all, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and those films in many ways were not Chinese films. Yes, they had Chinese and Hong Kong casts, but they really were crafted as Hollywood films, and that's one of the reasons why it crossed over. You know, 20 years ago, the films that were coming out of mainland China were not anywhere near the scope and the quality of the films that are coming out of mainland China today. Today's Chinese films technically are as good as any films in the West and what's coming out of Hollywood. But there is a difference, and the difference is, and as I say, vive la différence. You know, there is a difference between the syntax and language and storytelling sensibilities of the Chinese and of Hollywood. Now, Hollywood has been sent all over the world for so many years that people are much more open to American and Western style storytelling. But Chinese storytelling is unique to China. And, you know, Chinese storytelling works for a Chinese audience. Years ago, I gave a speech in Shenzhen, and I was talking about the difference between Hollywood and China in their filmmaking. And I thought to myself, if Chinese filmmakers are viewing Chinese films as a business, they've got the largest box office in the world, and they should make Chinese films for Chinese people. And the concept of exporting Chinese films, at least now, is a little bit difficult. I don't think it's a political thing. I think it's a language and a cultural thing.
And then why do you think, you know, films or TV series such as Squid Games, which is you know, one of the most popular TV shows on Netflix globally, is hugely successful with the Western audience, when you think about the fact that Squid Games, a Korean production, is also from Asia?
One of the problems Americans have is that oftentimes they talk about Asia, and that would be like sort of talking about North and South America. There are so many different cultures. China is China, Korea is Korea, Japan is Japan, the Philippines is Philippines, Thailand is Thailand. It's distinct and separate cultures with a separate language, separate sensibilities, and a separate ethos. And so the reason why Squid Games has done so well is because when Korea wound up becoming a major economic power and moving into the top 10 economies of the world, they decided to send their children to school in the United States. And a lot of their kids wound up studying cinema and studying the likes of David Fincher and Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, you know, and the lions of cinema in the United States back then. And so when they went back to South Korea, they had those language skills, the filmic language skills as they were, and they were able to make films that transitioned out of Korea and played so well in the United States. I mean, we could look at last year's Academy Awards. A Korean film won Best Picture of the Year.
Parasite.
So the Koreans have had the ability to transition and export their films, and right now China has not yet done so.
Mr. Scott Ross, Hollywood producer and film executive.
I'm hoping Ping-pong is one of those.
Good luck with that. Our sincere wishes and best wishes for your upcoming project on Ping-pong Diplomacy. That was Mr. Scott Ross, Hollywood producer and film executive, currently working on a feature film on Ping-pong Diplomacy. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for watching. Get in touch with me and our team on social media if you have any suggestions. Bye for now.